Hello, welcome to codeLive. Today, we will continue learning about external services. This time, we will see how to execute those external services from Apex. Previously, we saw how to add those external services and trigger those services from Flow using low-code tools. But today we will learn how to do it from code, from Apex. My name is Julián Duque. I'm a principal developer advocate here at Salesforce, and I'm super happy to be back after a long week at TDX to continuing with this codeLive. So let me share a couple of things that I had for you today. Remember, we have the Salesforce Developer website where you can find all the recent information that our amazing team has been publishing. You can find blog posts, videos, podcast episodes, and events that you can attend or watch online. And if you didn't have the opportunity to join us at Trailblazer DX in San Francisco, well, you can watch a lot of this content on Salesforce Plus. This is free. You can go on Salesforce Plus and take a look at the different content that we have for you all. Make sure to watch the keynotes. The main keynote was spectacular. You can also watch True to the Core, the platform keynote, MuleSoft, automation. We have a lot of different content that is very interesting for you. Some of my recommendations here, you can take a look at the Trailblazer DX highlights. Here you can find the different keynotes and comments from the MCs and our guests. You can find me here like presenting at Salesforce Plus as well. I will recommend you also to take a look at platform content where you will be able to check the platform keynote. They are going to talk about the roadmap and future releases of platform. And also, we have a specific collection for you, for Salesforce developers. And here you can find me again talking about Heroku. You can watch Chris Peterson talking about what's new in Apex. And you can take a look at the external services team talking pretty much about the topic we are going to be covering today. So I got inspired by this team, by this talk for this episode. I previously was using external services for Flow. I used external services for a demo we built at Trailblazer DX, and I said, okay, well, this is very interesting, and let's continue with the topic, and let's see how can we use these services from Apex. So make sure to go to our YouTube channel, search for the external services in Flow, because there are a lot of content that we are going to be reusing on this episode, so you can refresh this topic, and let's get this started. Well, first and foremost, in order to use external services, we will need to have an API. This API, as we mentioned before, needs to be an open API specification. Remember that on this previous episode, the external services in Flow, we were mentioning Open API specification, or Swagger is another term for it, that allows you to describe an API, the endpoints, and the schema, pretty much the different objects this API supports, on either JSON or YAML format. With this format, we will be able to import those services in Salesforce, and Salesforce we will be able to create code for you to access these API routes. This is how we can trigger those methods from Flow. I already built an API. This is a different API than the one I use for Flow. The one I used for Flow or for that episode was a restocking API for restocking orders. For this one, I decided to create an API to manage a bookstore. So on this API, I have two routes. One route is to get a list of books, and the other route is to create books. Easy. I have one get endpoint to get a list of books, and I have one post endpoint to create a list to create a book in the database. This API is deployed on Heroku. I built it using Node.js. I'm going to share this code as well, so you take a look how I build this API. And we can explore a little bit the source code so we understand what I'm doing internal with this API. And I'm using a framework called Fastify with a plugin that automatically generates the OpenAPI specification for me. If we see this website here, it's telling me that my API is an OpenAPI specification version 3. And it's giving me a JSON URL. If I click this URL, now I have the description of my API on JSON format. This is pretty much the file we need to import those services on Salesforce. It's telling me that we are using the OpenAPI 3.0. It's giving me information about the API, the different schemas or the objects that my API support. So I have two. One that represents a book that has different properties, the ID, the title, the author, and the publish date. Also, I'm specifying that I have two properties that I require to create a book: title and author. The other ones are going to be automatically created by this API. And I have an object that represents an error. This object has two properties: the error code and a message. And those two properties are going to be required. Then, this API is describing the routes. For example, the /books, the get method, has two different responses. One response is using the HTTP code 200, which is a success, and it returns the list of books. It's telling me that the content is JSON and that the schema is an array of books. So it is telling me that this returns a list of books. And I have also another code, which is 500, that will return an error if something fails. And the object that it returns is the error object. So I'm making a reference of the object that I have in the schema. And I also have the post route, which is to create the book. And it's telling me that the body of that request, it's a book object. So I will need to submit that book object, that book object is required. And the different responses that this API endpoint gives me are 201, which is the HTTP status code for created, and it will return the book that was created, now with the ID and the date. And if something failed, I will get the 500 error with that error object. And I have another route which automatically created that doesn't do anything pretty much. So this JSON file represents the whole API. And this UI is something that Swagger generates, or that's the plugin that I'm using generates, to easily document my API. So I can easily go, take a look at the different responses, how it looks like, and from here I can even execute the API. I will try this API, I will execute it, give me a list of books, and I don't have any book because my API is empty. Or I can try it out, the create a book. Let me try this route. You will need to provide a body. Remember that I only need the title and the author. And the title is going to be Introduction to External Services. And as an author, let's pick somebody from the chat. It's Devarun Sangupta. So allow me to use your name here. You are writing this book, Introduction to External Services. And when I execute this post request, it is returning, hey, I have the book. This is the ID. And pretty much this is the information that I'm returning here. Awesome. That's great. I have that information. If I execute again the list of books, let me click on execute, Now I have a body with an array that gives me the object that I just created on my database. So I know that my API is working. Now, how can I integrate this with Salesforce or with Apex? Let's get into it. Have a couple questions in the chat from the Varun. It says, does the OpenAPI support complex data types in a schema? And it is OpenAPI specification similar to RAML? It is similar to RAML, and I also, on my demo that I did for TDX, I imported this OpenAPI into MuleSoft. I had the reference, and I was able to deploy this API on Hop. And reference now using the MuleSoft External Services from Salesforce. So you can also do it. And what are complex data types? Can you specify a little bit about the complex data types, Devarun? Because what I'm doing here, and if we can go to the OpenAPI specification, let's go to OpenAPI, not OpenAI, sorry. OpenAPI initiative. Let me go to the specification, and I can search for the data types. Here on the data types, it supports integers, numbers, and strings. Those are the basic data types that I use for my data. And those can be formatted either as an integer 32 or 64 bits, as a float or double, as a password. Also, it supports rich text formatting. And it supports dates, it supports date times, it supports arrays, it supports objects. So I have different types that I can specify here. And if you want a complex data type, it will be an object with multiple properties. In our case, if we are seeing this specification, book, it's considered a complex data type because it is an object that has different types. Here I have the ID, which is of format UUID, and for example, the date, which is of format datetime. It is a string, it is stored and handled by a string, but this API is going to format this data as a datetime. Cool. How I build this? I'm not going into a lot of detail how I build this API because I am planning to have a specific episode teaching you how to build these APIs with Node.js, how to deploy them to Heroku, how to integrate them with a database. I already did that offline, but I can show you the code. I have this Books API. I'm using a plugin called Swagger for the Fastify framework, and I'm using Swagger UI plugin also for the Fastify framework, and the Postgres plugin that allows me to connect to a Postgres database. This database lives on Heroku as well as my application. So the database is the one that contains these books, this data. And then I am registering the plugins. I'm registering the database plugin with the specific configuration. So it points out to the database that is deployed on Heroku. I am registering the Swagger plugin, which converts all of my API routes into OpenAPI specification. And I am setting here the Swagger UI, pretty much it mounts on /API docs, this beautiful interface that I can interact and get the documentation for my API. And that's pretty much how I am defining the shape of my basic API specification. Then I have the schemas. The schemas is where I define the objects. I have the book schema, which is of type object, and it has the different properties that I showed you before. And I have the error schema, which is also an object that has the two different types. I'm using JavaScript here to define these objects. And then on my API definitions, I am registering those schemas, adding an ID or specifying an ID for those specific schemas. And now on every route, In this case, the get/books, the one that leads the books, I'm specifying the responses. 200, return a list of books, which is an array of books, and 500, it is an error. And the logic is just go to the database and perform an operation here. And the same with post. I am creating a book, pretty much. The body is a reference of that book object, and in my logic, I have just the PostgreSQL query to create this in my database. Okay, map. Map, it is not an object that is supported with OpenAPI specification. I have not seen that type or that complex type supported here. Object within object, sure, I think you can have object within object, nested objects, but maps, I don't think so. Okay, let's continue. This is how I implemented my API. It is connected to Postgres. But how can I bring this into Salesforce? Well, I have a Scratch org here that I created, and I already have two Lightning Web components. One web component, which is the form to create a book, and the other Lightning Web component, which is the data table that will print out the books from that database or from that external API. But this is not connected, so I am not doing anything here yet. We will do that live. We will see how to connect this live. How can I register that API? First, we go to Setup, and we will need to have a named credential that reference that external API. So I already have a named credential here, which is the Books API. It references that API that I have published on Heroku that you can access. It is public. It doesn't have a password. So if you can use it for your examples, free, please be my guest. So I have this name credential here, and this is the one that I need for importing the external services. After having the name credential with the proper permissions, I will go to External Services. So here on External Services, under the Integrations category, I have two options to register a new external service. So let me register a new external services. I can get external services from MuleSoft. If I have MuleSoft and a MuleSoft login, it will connect to MuleSoft and get the API from the Exchange. Or if I already have the API specification. So we will do it from the API specification because this API is not published on MuleSoft, it is published on Heroku. So let's get it from the API specification. In the case of blobs, you will need to have those blobs as base64, which are going to be strings. But maybe I will not recommend that. What I will do is provide an URL of where that file is stored. Let's say you are using a third-party storage like Amazon S3, and you can provide the URL where that file is stored. Because imagine if you have a 1 GB file, we don't want to return a 1 GB file as a string on an HTTP request. So you will want to return the link that reference to that file so you can fetch that file on a second process. That will be like a best way. If it is a small file, like an image, sure, maybe a base64 representation of that. But if it is a large file, I would recommend you to provide a link to that resource. Okay, so I'm registering a new external service here. So let's select the name credential, Books API. The service schema is going to be relative to that URL that I have here. And let's give it a name. Book Service. So I'm calling book service, this service that manages books. It's using this name credential, and then I need to pass the relative URL. What is the relative URL here? Is the URL that gives me that JSON file, but relative to the name credential. So I'm copying just the path, API docs JSON, and it fetch that JSON and it's telling me, okay, this is a valid schema. So now I have all the information that I need to import my services into Salesforce. Hey, Tech Lead, welcome. Okay, let's continue. Saved and next. Now, external services parse that OpenAPI specification file and it identifies the operations. So I have access to two operations here, get books and post books. It is telling me the input parameters. So far, post books require a body. Body is going to be what I'm passing with the book information that I'm going to be creating. And the output parameters are the error codes that I'm specifying. So the error codes, 201, 500, and other properties that it will be returning. This is defined on the OpenAPI specification. Which ones do I want to import? Get books and post books. I don't need this other one because it doesn't do anything. So I'm just going to import the ones that I need. I click on next, and it will generate code for me. So it is telling me, look, this is what I'm going to generate. I'm going to generate an Apex class that represents an error. I'm going to represent an Apex class that represents a book. And I'm going to generate an Apex class that represents the full service. Fantastic. Let's generate that for me. I generate those methods and that class, and now I have one external service of 150. 150 is going to be the limit. I have two operations of 1,250. Those are going to be the limits right now, and the different operations that I'm specifying here. Cool. Awesome. I register my API. Now I need to take a look at my service. What methods has been created, what classes, and how can I access this from Apex? We already saw that accessing this from Flow is easy. You can go to a flow and pretty much go and insert an action, search the action as an external service, and you will find those methods in there. Straightforward. But for Apex, we will need to go to the Apex class viewer and take a look to what it was generated for us. Now let's go to Apex classes. And here we will see all my Apex classes that I have created. In this case, books controller. I already have an empty controller that I will be connecting to my LWC components. And then I have dynamic Apex classes. And here is where the magic begins. Santanu says, it will be helpful if you can tell us about initial Node.js configuration, how you connected from app.js and index.js. Okay, so that's a good question. I'm not going into a lot of details because I am planning to have a full episode about this. But this framework I'm using, Fastify.js, it has an auto-load functionality that it will automatically load the files that are under the plugins directory and the routes directory. If I go to the routes directory, I have this root.js file. This root.js file is the one that defines the two methods, the get/books and the post/books. And the schema, this index.js, I am exporting two objects, book schema and error schema. So from root, I am importing those two objects, book schema and error schema, from that index.js class that lives under the schemas directory. That's pretty much how I am doing the import using ECMAScript modules here. But as I said, I will show you how to do this from scratch. I promise I will have an episode for you all in the upcoming weeks, maybe in about a month or so, teaching you how to do this from scratch. But so far, believe me, we already have this implemented and we will see how to do it later, okay? Beautiful. I have the classes. I have the class that represents the book. I have the class that represents the error, and I have the class that represents the whole service. So let's take a look to the book class. Let's give it a little zoom here because it's too small. And we see that we have a class called book service book that has 4 properties: an ID, a title, an author, and the publish at. 3 as a string and 1 as a datetime. So automatically Apex detects that this is a format datetime, and it will try to cast that information into the specific type. And this class lives under the external service namespace. So we will need to take this into account. In order to use this in Apex, we will need to use the namespace and the class name. So this Apex class viewer is going to be your friend when implementing these methods. Now let's take a look at book service. Book service is going to be more complex, but we will be able to navigate. And let's give it a little bit more zoom so we can properly read. Here, I am specifying the methods that I can access from my service. For example, I have getBooks. GetBooks returns a GetBooks response. What is a GetBooks response? A GetBooks response is a class that contains a list of books, the object we already saw, under the code 200 property. So the code 200, remember, represents the success. And we also specify an exception for that specific response that will contain the book service error on the code 500 property. So Apex, what it's doing is mapping those properties from the JSON into Apex classes. So external services is creating this code for you. And also we have here the postBooks method. The postBooks method is the one that allows me to create a book. It needs a postBooks request, which is the input parameter, and return a postBooks response. The request needs a body property that is of type book service book. So I will need to create a book service book to specify that input parameter. And the response contains the book that has been created on the code 201 property. So as you can see, this is automated, created for us. What are the main advantages of using these automated classes? Normally, when we want to do HTTP callouts from Apex, we will need to use the HTTP class, specify the headers, use the name credential, set up the input object, parse the output. Normally, the output is going to be a string. We will need to parse it, extract the property. So there is a lot of operations in there. These auto-generated classes are going to give me this already pre-made for us. We don't need to worry about those details. If for some reason the API changes, you can update the specification and the classes are going to be updated with those changes as well. Let's say the API change a property name, or the API is returning more information. the code will auto-generate these changes as well when you update the service. So let's keep this open because we will be referencing this file and then start implementing our methods. Okay. Hi, Sar. Hola, Julián. I see this is pretty similar to generate class from WSDL. How editable are these classes? I am thinking about API versioning. Well, this is similar, but using REST APIs and using OpenAPI. That's pretty much why OpenAPI was implemented, to have a standard of specifying APIs and being able to have tools to generate code. You can specify versioning, let's say, by having a different class name here. Let's say book service version 1, going to the specific OpenAPI specification for the version 1 of the API, or book service version 2, depending on what you want to do and manage that. And you can also create wrappers. So these are the basic classes using the external service namespace prefix, but you can also create a wrapper that takes care of the main operations, and then you can change the code internally of what class are you going to be referencing, either the version 1 or the version 2, so you don't need to change the whole logic of your application, just the implementation of that wrapper class. If you go to the documentation, the Apex documentation using Salesforce features with Apex under external services, there is a page that shows you how to invoke those external services callouts using Apex. So this is a documentation that you might want to reference, and here is showing you a very good practice. And this is the practice that I was talking about. The second link here, use Apex to create a callout to external service, and I will be sharing these links on the description of this live. Here, it will give you instructions how to implement a bank service. This is from the Trailhead module. There is a Trailhead module that teaches you how to use external services. And here, this is using that referencing to the external service class within a class that you are defining. So this is the wrapper class that references that other class that it was auto-generated for you. So if you want to change the implementation, you change the implementation of the wrapper if you want to keep versioning. So it is going to be up to you how to manage that. And I hope this answers your question. Let's continue because I have less than 30 minutes to write all this code. Okay. Let me go to my Salesforce project. So I have a Salesforce project. I have two components, the book list, which has a lining data table. We will show the books from this API. And we have a book form, which has two inputs to create a book that will use that postBooks method. Okay, let's implement book list first. So book list, I already have the columns, but I don't have the data. I need to implement this loadBooks method. This loadBooks method will call the controller and get the information. So let me open the books controller. I created this class, books controller, that doesn't have anything, with the two methods, create a book and list books. So let me implement this. First, in order to list the books, I need to have an instance of the service. So let me create an instance of the service. External service, book service, book service. So now I created an instance of this book service class. Remember that this is under the external service namespace. Cool. Then, in order to list the books, remember that I have a getBooks method that returns a getBooks response. So we will need to get that response. External service, book service, getBooks response. This is the response. And I will call the getBooks method from my service. So I'm calling getBooks, which will return this response. And this response object has a property called code200 that has my list. So let me get the list. List of external service, book service, book. Now this is the book type. I have the books, and I'm getting these books from response code200. Code200, I am getting the list of book service books. And then what I need to do is return those books. So let's change my code. So my method return that list. And that's it. 3 lines to return the books. Obviously, if you want to make this more error proof, you have access to the exceptions, the response exception in this case. So you might want to wrap this on a try catch, get the extension, get the message, return the message back to the Lightning Web component so you can show the error in there. But let's do this quick. Let's see if we can wire this controller method into my Lightning Web component. So remember, I create an instance of the book service. I am getting the response. And from the response, I am getting the list. And then I am returning the books. Now let's go to books list, import that list books method from my Apex controller, and not get the data. So my data is from list books. Cool. But I'm using a sync await here. Let's wrap this into a try catch. And remember that we already saw asynchronous JavaScript, so you might know this if you have attended to the codeLive. If not, go ahead and take a look at the mastering asynchronous JavaScript to see how to perform these operations. Let's see if we have an error. Let's print that error in the console. Later, we will be able to manage that on my interface. I'm not worried about that. I need the data, and this data is going to be made available into my data property here. So let's take a look at book list component. It's binding the data, it's binding the columns, and it's using the ID as the key. And when I hit refresh, it will execute handle refresh, which call the loadBooks method. And also when my component is mounted, it will call connected callback, and it will load the books. So this is how I'm loading the books, when the component renders and when I click refresh. Now it's time to deploy. SF deploy metadata on the org Apex external scratch. So let's deploy those 2 changes, the component and the books controller. Let's hope I don't have any error. If I don't have any error, this will succeed. If I have an error, it will show me the error. So far, it worked. Let me go to my home. The list is empty. I will refresh. When the component mounts, I have Introduction to External Services by the Varun. So the Varun, thank you very much for providing this book to us. If I add another book here, remember that we have access to this API testing. So introduction to Apex by, let's pick somebody from the chat, Santanu. You wrote introduction to Apex, execute. Let's go to home, click on refresh, and now I have the book here. So I connected my Lightning Web Component application with this Apex controller, and this Apex controller is calling to this external service, and all this code was automatically generated for us by Salesforce. The key here is to have a good Open API specification definition. If we have that definition, we will be able to generate good code and use that code. Now, how can we create a book? Let's go ahead and take a look at the code to create a book. So far, anybody has questions here? Let me know if you have any questions. Feel free to interrupt me. I will be monitoring the chat. And let's continue. Let's create a book. To create a book, I have a form. In this form, I have two inputs. One input to capture the title and one input to capture the author. Those are required. And I have the two methods to get that information. So I have the method that gets the title, I have the method that gets the author, and I have the handle create. But so far, I don't have logic that creates this book. So let's implement this logic on my book controller. Are these IDs have any significance? No. Those IDs are just UUIDs that I am generating automatically. If I show you the API, it is just generating a random ID just to have something unique on my database. But if we are using a bookstore, maybe you want to use the ISBN, which is the proper code for books that is unique. But since this is a mock API just for educational purposes, I just wanted to implement a random ID. That's it. So it is not just an auto-incremental number, it is just a random UUID. Good. And let's implement that book controller. So let's go back and take a look at our reference, which is the Apex class viewer. And let's see what do we need to create a book. So here we have post books. Let's go back to Zoom here. So we have post books. Post books requires an input, and that input is of type post books request. And also that post books request has a property that's a property called body that is of type book service book. So I need to do a couple of things here. First, this create book method requires a string with the title and a string with the author. Second, I will need to have an instance, of course, of my book service, because I will be using the same book service to create the book. Second, I need to create the book. So external service book service book. That's the book that I'm going to be creating. Let me copy and paste this. And now the book has a title and the book has an author. Perfect. So I create the body object, the book. Then I will need to create the request, which is the input. So to create the request, external service book service postbook request. This is the input. Let me copy and paste this class name. And now this input on the body property will have that book input. Okay. See, the body property is the one that contains the book. Awesome. And we need a response. External service, book service. The response is postbook response. And then we call the service. The method is called postbooks. And we pass the input. Then we will see what to do with the response, depending on what we have. So let's see the response here returns on the property code 201 the book. So we can return the book as an object. And here we can do this response code 201. So when we create a book, we get the response back. And that's what we are going to pass to our Lightning Web component. Cool. Questions here. Rajan, how to use JWT name credentials to call third-party API to make sure I'm calling API securely? So let me take a look. I haven't done that. But for this name credential, let me open another setup page. For this name credential, I'm using the new version of name credentials. So for using those credentials, you will need to provide an external credential. So when you create external credential, you have different authentication protocols. It could be OAuth, it could be AWS, or it could be custom. When it is custom, in the case of mine, the one that I created, you can specify your custom headers. And here in custom headers, you will be able to pass that JSON Web Token that you have for that specific API, depending on the header you will need to provide. Also, on the name credential, you can also pass certain parameters as well. So you can also pass custom headers, and you can pass custom authentication parameters as well. So it depends what the API needs. The name credential has support for those custom properties. What I was doing? Creating a book. Okay, so I have the controller to create a book that receives the title and author. I have the service instance. I am creating the book object. I am creating the request object, which is the input of my method. I am creating the book, and then I am returning the book that was created, so we will have the ID. Cool. Let's wire this up on my controller. So let's import create book, and now on handle create, I have a try catch. I get the error. I print if there is an error, because we might get errors from the API, we don't know. And then I get the data that this returns, create a book, and the title comes from this component, and the author comes from this component. And then let's print to the console the data object. So we will be able to have like a success message with the ID, with that information, but let's do something basic. Let's just at least try to see if our book was created, if our APIs are connected. Let's deploy the changes to my Scratch org. If everything is good, no errors. If I made a mistake, normally I commit a lot of typos, it will tell me. But so far, let's see, one component of two. So far, I failed. So, illegal conversion from external service book service to book service book. Okay. Book controller, book service book, pay line 3. Okay. See, I have something wrong here. Book service. Oh, of course. I need to specify the namespace. I was missing the namespace. See, the namespace is super important for this. Okay, continuing with the deployment. Now it should work. Perfect, my Apex class is deployed. Go to here, and let's create a book. Let's refresh. And Rajan, you are going to be our next author. Please share with me the name of a book. If you want, Rajan is going to be the next author. Provide a name of a book. Give me some random name so I can create it. Okay, waiting. So far we have seen how to get this external API, registered external API using external services on Salesforce. Salesforce automatically generates the classes for us, the types, and I will be able to use those directly from Apex. I don't need to use any HTTP callout. I don't need to parse any information. All of those objects are already created for me. Okay, so while Rajan thinks, maybe I will use his question. So integrating JWT with name credentials. That's the new book. Let me go to the console because we are returning an object, and I want to see this object. Where is the developer console? It is not opening the developer console, developer tools. Okay, now. So I will see the console here with the object that I will be creating. Let's see if I don't have any error. Let's creating a book using the Books API. It didn't work. So it didn't push the changes. So integrating JWT with name credentials by Rajan. Okay, it seems the deployment didn't work. I am creating a book using the Books API. This is the handle create, and let me confirm I am calling the right thing. Okay. Let's change something. Maybe with the previous error, the component didn't deploy properly. I'm going to retry the deployment. Let's retry the deployment. Now the component is going to be refreshed. Okay, let's refresh my Scratch org. And let's see if it works. And this is going to be the last thing we do here. Okay, Rajan, integrating JWT with name credentials by Rajan. Let's create. Okay, awesome. Now it's created. It's returning the object, Rajan, the ID, the title, and if I refresh, now I have the object on my database. So we saw how to connect these two methods, like straightforward, getting the OpenAPI specification, using external services, and having access to this. If you also register those external services using the mules of integration, it's going to be exactly the same. Those classes are going to be available to you under the external service namespace, and you will be able to connect them either to Flow or to Apex. Fantastic. Thank you very much. This is pretty much what I had for you all today. Let's hope you like this content and stay connected with us. Next week, we will take a look at Lightning Web Components composition, so you will see how to compose different components. And later, we will see how to communicate between components using messages and the Lightning message system. We will have GraphQL support with Alba Rivas, and I have some MuleSoft guests that are going to start showing you how to integrate Salesforce with MuleSoft as well. Stay tuned. We have a lot of great content for you all. Go ahead, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Click on that little bell so you are notified every time we go live, every time we publish a new video. And I will be pushing the code examples after this live. If you don't see those today, please ping me on Twitter or ping me on LinkedIn. I already gave you the information on the chat, so I give you access to the code and the examples. I will be doing that, and that's pretty much it. Thank you very much for joining me, and see you on the next one. Bye-bye.